So tell me a little bit about how the campaign has gone so far. You've been out talking with people and all that, so tell me just a little bit about that.
It's been going wonderful. Ours is a grassroots campaign. We've been focused on reaching and moving people, and we've done that. That's how I won the nomination. People were shocked, but our people came out to the convention, stayed, made sure that I won, and I think they're going to do the same thing on Tuesday, November 5th. I think they're going to go to the polls, they're going to get their friends out, they're going to make sure that I win become the next Lieutenant Governor of Virginia.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the big issues that are right now. Can you talk to me a little bit about the Second Amendment and gun control? Just now we've had another shooting reported at Los Angeles Airport. There's a TSA agent was killed, is what we're hearing now. There's another school shooting recently. Can you talk a little bit about your stance on gun control?
Sure. Of course, it's always tragic when people lose their lives or they're injured in gun violence. I think we've got to do something about our mental health system so that people who are inclined to violence, who may be a danger to themselves and to others, can in fact be hospitalized. We had, in the last couple of years, 200 times a year, doctors have sought to be detained orders, got none of them granted, so people are left on the street. In terms of gun control itself, it's a Second Amendment right. I believe very strongly in defending that right. I think the rules regarding obtaining and keeping weapons only affects law-abiding citizens because they're the only ones who are interested in abiding by whatever rules we create. I think we've got to make sure that law-abiding citizens can get and keep firearms to protect themselves and their families.
I want to talk a little bit about marriage equality, same-sex marriage. You're not a supporter of same-sex marriage. Can you talk a little bit about that? Whereas there was a poll that came out that says the majority of Virginians do support same-sex marriage. Can you explain a little bit?
Well, they didn't when we voted for a constitutional amendment to define marriage as a union between one man and one woman. I just think it is ultimately dangerous to tinker with an institution that's 6,000 years old, that has been around since time immemorial, has clearly been the best institution for raising children, clearly is necessary for the propagation of the species, and to say, well, we've decided we think it's too limited and we're going to change the definition. I think there are many people concerned about where that ends. I think private relationships between people are their business and nobody else's, but the institution of marriage is a societal institution that I think needs to be preserved as always has been, and that is as a union between one man and one woman. I therefore support what the people of Virginia did when they passed the constitutional amendment. I'm going to fight to keep that amendment in place. And unfortunately, I know there are others, including my opponent, who really don't care what the will of the people is. They want to overturn that. And I just think that's dangerous for politicians to think they know better than the people.
I want to talk a little bit about Planned Parenthood. There's a section on your website about Planned Parenthood, and you made some comments about Planned Parenthood. You wanted to fund it. And can you talk a little bit about Planned Parenthood and abortion, your thoughts on all of that together?
Well, look, I've been very hotly criticized for comments about Planned Parenthood, but nobody's asked whether the comments are true. It's true that Margaret Sanger was a racist. It's true that Margaret Sanger thought that the propagation or the population of minority people, of what she called feeble-minded people, was a problem for society. She tried eugenics. That wasn't very good PR. That she was very sympathetic to the ideas of Hitler and the Ku Klux Klan. And now it just turns out that Planned Parenthood is in part responsible for 37% of the minority babies being aborted, of the babies being aborted are minority babies, the babies of black women. I think that's a problem. And in our civil rights formula, anytime there is a disparate impact on a minority community, we're taught you ought to be suspect, even if you don't have a motive or you don't know why it happens. This seems to be the only exception. Most of these women having abortions are poor women, they're black women. Planned Parenthood tends to plant itself in these sorts of communities. And frankly, I made the comment that I think Planned Parenthood has been more lethal, at least, to black life than the Ku Klux Klan ever was. If you just count the raw numbers of potential black babies who have been destroyed, I think the numbers are staggering. And therefore, look, abortion is legal in America. I accept that. But I don't think we ought to be funding Planned Parenthood with a single tax dollar. I don't think it's fair to ask citizens to spend their money to support Planned Parenthood.
So you support the bill that was passed, not too far long ago, about ultrasounds for women that want to have abortions to have ultrasounds.
Well, I wasn't in the legislature at the time, obviously, and look, my approach to this is persuasion. I think that has always got to be the first line of defense, because we're seeing it, for example, with the Affordable Care Act. If you jam something down people's throats, if you force something on them, then all you do is create ongoing division and debate and hard feelings. I think that abortion really is a moral question, and I think continuing to persuade people, and science I think is helping us do that, as we find out that babies are fairly early on susceptible to pain. We find out that earlier and earlier they can live outside their mother's womb. We know that, of course, the baby is a separate body because it has a separate DNA strand. I think as we continue to persuade people to think about the moral implications of what they are doing. I mean, after all, I'm only sitting here because I wasn't aborted. And we continue to do that. I think eventually people will realize that abortion is really not a good thing, and we ought to do everything in our power to eliminate it.
You mentioned Obamacare. Talk a little bit about your stance on the Affordable Care Act. Now, there's the administration I heard just this morning was talking about those plans that they said you were going to be able to keep your plan, but in reality that's not going to happen for some people. They're claiming those plans were junk plans. That's the term that's being used, and that's why they're not able to keep those plans. Talk a little bit about how you feel about the Affordable Care Act.
Well, first of all, I always think it's a sad thing when the government thinks it knows better than the individual citizen what's good for them. I think that's the road to authoritarianism. I think the impulse to want to make sure that our poor citizens have health care is the right one. Look, I've spent years in ministry. I want everybody to have health care. I want poor people to have it. I just don't think the way to do that is to have a government takeover of health care and to have what we're having now, which estimates now at a minimum 15 million people will be thrown off their health care plans and forced onto an exchange plan because the federal government thinks it's a better plan for you. That's not the way to go. I think free market principles, some of the free clinics that are providing health care around the Commonwealth of Virginia are just remarkable in the service that they are providing. Catastrophic health care insurance for some, chronic care for those maybe who have cancer or have diabetes or have something that requires ongoing treatment in order to save their lives. I think there are ways to do this that are far less drastic than what we have now, which is just a complete government takeover of our healthcare system.
Just yesterday, the Supreme Court of Virginia came down with the ruling overturning the unconstitutionality of the tunnel tolls here on the downtown and midtown tunnel. Talk a little bit about these tolls. Do you agree with this public-private act that was passed that has enabled this to happen? How do you feel about those tolls?
Well, I don't have a problem in theory with public-private partnerships. I think they can be helpful. I think they've got to be carefully crafted and tailored, but I do believe that a toll is a tax, and that when you devolve that responsibility to a private entity, I think that you are on shaky constitutional ground. Now, obviously, the Virginia Supreme Court did not agree with me in this instance, but I also believe that when you have citizens profoundly upset about how public policy is being handled and its economic impact on them, I think it's going to be incumbent upon the legislature in the next session to go back and think through how we do this in a way that, here again, brings citizens together rather than having people continuing to fight. Because now, of course, you're talking about a federal lawsuit, talking about trying to take this to the Supreme Court. Look, I have not gotten a lot of credit for this, but I've spent all my life in ministry trying to bring people together. Look, sure, I have strong convictions, no question about that, but I'm always willing to listen. I think people ought to listen to each other. And I think we've got to come back and talk to each other, talk to the local folks about how we solve this problem to make sure that Elizabeth Crossing gets built in a way that people can be happy with.
Thank you. You are passionate about education in the
Yes.
Commonwealth. What would you propose that we do as a state together to improve the quality of our education?
Well, part of that is my background. I grew up very poor, was in foster care, and ended up getting a degree from Harvard Law School because I had an opportunity to get a quality education in public schools, by the way. My wife is a product of public schools. In fact, we were high school sweethearts, and my wife teaches in public school right now. So we're committed to the idea that the public schools ought to deliver a quality education. We just believe that you can no longer force parents into the school that the government thinks is best for them. I think parental choice is the essential element of any school reform, and I support a constitutional amendment to bring that about so that the resources follow the child, are not dictated by a government bureaucracy. But the second thing is, I think we have got to come back to basics rather than focusing so much on the SOLs. And in theory, I don't have a problem with testing. We've got to measure our children's progress. We're having such difficulty these days educating children. We've got to figure out where we're succeeding and where we're not. But I think we've come to a point where in many instances we're just teaching to the test. And that to me is not educating. Children ought to be taught to read, to write, to think analytically. They ought to be taught something about our history, about science, about math, biology, physiology, chemistry. I don't understand, frankly, how we've gone so wrong, because my wife and I were products of public schools in a working class community and got an education that prepared us for college. We emerged capable of reading well, writing well. And we've got to somehow find our way back to that. And I think coming back to basics rather than teaching to test or following whatever the newest fad is one way to do it.
I want to talk to you a little bit about ethics reform. There's a lot of criticism going on ever since the Star Scientific scandal came out in McDonald's office. Do you think that we should do away with all gifts? Should we report everything that we get? What do you think about ethics reform?
Well, I'm always in favor of full disclosure. I think if there's nothing wrong with what you're doing and you're serving in public office, you ought not have any problem with the public knowing what's going on. Where there are transactions that are happening particularly between an elected official and anyone who is potentially doing business with the state. So full disclosure, I think, is important. But I think, here again, persuasion and education are important to me. I think when people know better, they do better. And I think we have got to have some training for every elected official who takes office, some ethics training, to talk about where the pitfalls are, where the problems potentially could be. Some of these problems may start with a small infraction that grows into something larger. I think we need to make people sensitive to what the small infractions might be before they become major problems. Because I think if you can create all the rules you want, for people who are not interested in following ethical rules, or they're self-interested and self-absorbed, they want to do what they think is going to enrich themselves, they're going to always find a way around rules. So I'd like to see some sort of ethics class or seminar for every person who takes office.
You mentioned persuasion and education. How would you, as Lieutenant Governor, persuade and educate our delegates and our representatives in the General Assembly to bring about some legislation that you think we may need to have in the Commonwealth?
Well, I said once elected, one of the first things I will do is to pick up the phone and call not only Republican senators, but Democrat senators and say, look, I want to be the president of the Senate for you as well. I want to be fair to you. I want you to know that you'll have an honest hearing about any concerns that you have. But I think you've also got to stay in touch with grassroots people, because the reality is that the lieutenant governor really, as a political matter, means nothing to a senator or a delegate unless that lieutenant governor has a lot of support among grassroots people who are going to be heard by that senator and that delegate. So I want to continue to be that kind of leader, to go out, talk to people, and to listen to people, to find out what their concerns are, what their interests are, and then be able to reflect that as president of the Senate, so that when fellow senators, or senators I should say, I won't be a senator, but so that when senators hear me speak, or delegates for that matter, they'll know he's not just speaking for himself. He's someone who really has the ear and has the heart of the people.
I want to talk a little bit about sequestration going on right now. That's impacting a lot of people here in Hampton Roads. We're a really big military area. We've got a lot of defense contractors that are civilians. How would you all in Richmond work with the federal government to stop sequestration or to fix what's going on here locally in Hampton Roads?
Well, one of the reasons why I opposed the shutdown from the beginning is that it hurts Virginia worse than any other state. I mean, 40% of our economy depends on Department of Defense spending. Here in Hampton Roads, we are especially vulnerable. Hampton Roads, of course, Northern Virginia as well, but Hampton Roads depends upon the federal government for our economy to the tune of about 33%. Sequestration affected 90,000 people in Hampton Roads. If sequestration were to run its course, we would lose 122,800 jobs here in Hampton Roads alone. It would devastate our economy. I think we've got to get proactive. I think we, meaning all of us, no matter who's elected, needs to get with our congressional delegation. That means the Republicans and the Democrats need to get together, and we need to march up, so to speak, march up to the federal government, march up to Capitol Hill, march up to the White House, march to wherever we need to go, and make the case for why we've got to solve these problems, because it not only threatens the economy of Hampton Roads and Virginia, but it threatens our national security. This area is one of the most important areas to our national security in the country. So sequestration is a horrible way to solve our budget problems. So is a government shutdown. But I think if people can come together, if representatives can come together, Democrats and Republicans, about state and federal, because there's not much communication right now between state and federal elected officials, I think we can have a tremendous impact on what's going on in Washington.